April 1st, 2026, the Kremlin. Vladimir Putin tells Armenia's Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan that Russia has many friends in Armenia. It's not a pleasantry, it's a threat. 3 days earlier, a man tried to strike Pashinyan in a church on Palm Sunday. A Russian president issuing threats, a prime minister attacked during worship, a country 2 months from an election that will decide whether it breaks west or stays in Moscow's orbit. And at the center of it all, a 1,700-year-old church that may be one of the most potent institutional levers Russia has left in the South Caucasus. I'm Bruce Pannier. I've spent 4 decades covering the former Soviet Union. This is Turan Research Center, hosted by the Yorktown Institute, where we break down the geopolitics of Turkey, Iran, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. Subscribe, and let's get into it. Before we get to the politics, we need to go back from today's headlines, because the story of the Armenian Church as a geopolitical tool doesn't start in the 2020s. It starts with the Soviet security services. Armenia's adoption of Christianity as the state religion in 301 AD, among the earliest such acts in recorded history, bound faith and national identity together in ways few civilizations can match. For 17 centuries, the Armenian Apostolic Church has been the beating heart of Armenian identity through empires, genocide, Soviet occupation, and independence.
Church has always been a kind of guarantor or responsible for conserving the Armenian identity because the Armenian identity is inseparable from the Armenian Christianity. In the sense that the Armenian Christianity is very special.
During the Soviet period, religious institutions across the USSR were systematically infiltrated by the KGB. Churches were destroyed and then selectively resurrected, but under a condition. The security services would control them from the inside. The Mitrokhin Archive, a trove of leaked KGB documents, confirms that senior hierarchs across the Soviet religious institutions were almost always integrated into intelligence networks. Lower-ranking clergy weren't always recruited, but at the top, penetration was near total. Armenia was no exception. A significant proportion of Armenian clergy serving abroad during the Soviet era were KGB recruits.
Why they used Armenian Church and less Georgian Church, for example? Simple, because Armenian Church has ties with Armenians abroad. Again, it's normal, but this was the Soviet interest, just as they used the Russian Orthodox Church abroad to play their Soviet games.
And here's the critical point. Many of these connections didn't disappear when the Soviet Union collapsed.
Влияние не обязательно должно быть именно через спецслужбы, но спецслужбисты имеют конкретное влияние. Вот. Потому что в России, там, надо понимать, сам президент спецслужбист, все его помощники, да, там, спецслужбисты, они назначены в администрации президента, они назначены там вплоть до Россотрудничества. Надо понимать, верхушка церкви Армении, там же не только брат католикоса, да, там, многие же, они же прошли тоже через службы России, не только в Москве, в Екатеринбурге, да, в Краснодаре, в Сочи. Поэтому влияние огромное. Это не фантастика, это не конспирология какая-то. Потому что компроматы, они никуда не делись со времен Советского Союза. Они просто перешли. Да, архивы-то, они остаются.
Armenian parliamentarians have stated publicly that institutional and personal ties between the church hierarchy and Russian intelligence persisted well into the post-Soviet period. This brings us to Catholicos Karakin II, the current head of the Armenian Apostolic Church. His election in 1999 has been dogged by allegations circulating among dissident clergy and analysts that it occurred under Russian pressure, with factions tied to the Soviet-era security apparatus playing a role. These allegations have never been conclusively resolved. What we do know is this: Karakin II has publicly called Russia the second homeland of Armenians. He's received high-level Russian state honors, including an award from Vladimir Putin himself.
I think it would at the very least be fair to say that the Armenian Church retains some pro-Russian sympathies and retains sympathies for the prior pro-Russian government, which Pashinyan, of course, was able to oust in 2018. And what this means is that now the church is effectively the last remaining major public institution in Armenia, which Pashinyan hasn't been able to exert control over. And for this reason, it's the primary mechanism by which Moscow is able to exercise its influence in Armenia.
Whether those connections represent active coordination or residual affinity, the pattern is unmistakable. The church's leadership sits at the intersection of religious authority, Soviet-era intelligence legacies, and pro-Russian elite networks. And for most of Armenia's post-independence history, none of that was a problem, because the people running the country were already on the same side. For most of Armenia's post-independence history, the Armenian Apostolic Church didn't need to be political, because the politicians were already doing what the church wanted. Armenia's presidents were uniformly pro-Russian, embedded in oligarchic patronage networks, and broadly aligned with the church's worldview. The church occupied a space of moral authority without needing to exercise political power directly. It was a comfortable arrangement. The state handled politics, the church handled identity, and both existed in a symbiosis with the same elite class. Think of it this way. Why intervene in a system that already serves your interests? The church, the old guard politicians, and Russia's security establishment weren't three separate actors. They were overlapping nodes in the same network. As long as that network controlled Armenia, the church could remain above politics. That ended in 2018. Nikol Pashinyan's Velvet Revolution swept away the old order on an anti-corruption, reformist platform. The oligarchs lost their grip. The security services were shaken up, and suddenly the church found itself in a new Armenia, one where its traditional allies were out of power, and the new government was talking about transparency, institutional reform, and diversifying away from Russia. The comfortable silence was over, almost immediately. The early signs of friction were subtle. Bureaucratic tensions, rhetorical signals. The church began positioning itself not as a partner of the new government, but as a check on it. Clergy started making public statements, questioning the direction of reform. The subtext was clear. The Velvet Revolution had disrupted the network, and the church was the most resilient node that survived. Then came 2020, and the rupture became open. The second Nagorno-Karabakh war was a catastrophe for Armenia. In 44 days, Azerbaijan recaptured territories that Armenia had held since the 1990s. The ceasefire brokered by Russia left Armenia diminished and its society traumatized. The church framed its response in spiritual and civilizational terms. The loss of Karabakh is a wound to Armenian Christianity itself. But the substance of the church's opposition increasingly overlapped with something else entirely. The agenda of the secular political forces who wanted to halt any normalization with Azerbaijan and Turkey, and who wanted Pashinyan gone.
It doesn't mean that everything they are doing is dictated from Moscow, no. But their way of what they want to do in Armenia, the church, it overlaps with the Russian interest, meaning that Russia is not interested in the win of Pashinyan, because if Pashinyan wins, so he will amend the constitution, which in its turn will lead to finalization of a peace plan, peace with Azerbaijan, and Armenian orientation towards the West and America.
This convergence became impossible to ignore in 2024 when Archbishop Bagrat Kastanian launched the Tabush for Our Fatherland movement. Tens of thousands marched against the border delimitation. The movement framed territorial compromise not as a policy choice, but as a betrayal of the Armenian identity and faith. And it wasn't just Kastanian. Shirak Archbishop Mikhail Ajapkanian went further, calling the Pashinyan administration traitors who, and I quote, deserve to be shot. By shifting the debate from constitutional legality to existential morality, the church was doing something very specific. It was trying to delegitimize not just a policy, but the entire democratic mandate behind it. If the question is, should we negotiate borders, that's politics. and elections decided. But if the question becomes, is our very soul being sold, then no election result matters. And that's exactly the framing Moscow needs.
Հայոց եկեղեցու կողքին ու հայ ժողովրդի կողքին ունենալու եմ անմիջական մասնակցություն, եթե չհաջողվի քաղաքական գործիչներին, ուրեմն մենք էլ մեր ձևով ենք մասնակցելու այդ ամեն ինչին։
Intelligence legacies are one channel. Money is another. Samuel Karapetyan is a Russian-Armenian billionaire and owner of Tashir Group. He's one of the wealthiest Armenians on earth, and his business empire was built in Russia, deeply intertwined with the Kremlin's political and economic establishment. How intertwined? His company was awarded the state contract to build the new headquarters of the Investigative Committee of Russia, one of the Kremlin's most sensitive law enforcement bodies. In Russia, contracts like that don't go to outsiders. Russian media have described him as one of the kings of state procurement, a term for oligarchs whose success is directly tied to government networks. Karapetyan was named in the U.S. Treasury's 2018 Kremlin list and sanctioned by Ukraine. He's been identified in Armenian media as a major donor to church-linked initiatives and opposition causes. And during the 2020 war, Azerbaijan President Ilham Aliyev accused him of facilitating the transfer of weapons and fighters from Russia to Armenia. In June 2025, Karapetyan was arrested in Armenia on charges of inciting unrest and alleged coup plotting involving church allies. The timing was no coincidence. It came alongside the arrest of senior clergy, including Archbishop Galastanyan. The pattern here mirrors established Kremlin practices across the post-Soviet space. Combine religious legitimacy, oligarchic financing, and political mobilization to preserve influence where secular proxies have weakened. It's a playbook, and Armenia isn't the first place we've seen it. If this story sounds familiar, it should, because we've seen a version of it before, in Ukraine. Before Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, under the Moscow Patriarchate, served as a key vehicle for Russian influence. Moscow invoked shared Orthodox heritage to justify political claims. Church structures were used to propagate narratives framing Ukrainian statehood as illegitimate, to challenge Kiev's authority, and to undermine Western support for Ukraine by casting it as interference in historically Orthodox lands. The playbook was clear. Use ecclesiastical structures as proxy battlegrounds, where Russia's border strategic aims get articulated through the language of faith and historical unity. Armenia now faces a parallel dilemma. The AAC's transnational ties, historical intelligence linkages, and political mobilization echo the patterns observed in Ukraine. The difference is that in Armenia, the process is still in its early stages, which means there's still time to address it, but not much. And there's another parallel worth mentioning: Serbia. In the 1990s, the Serbian Orthodox Church helped mobilize nationalist sentiment over Kosovo, with the Kremlin amplifying those narratives. The result? Conflict, international isolation, stalled European integration, and lasting trauma. When churches intersect with foreign power networks, the consequences can be devastating. All of this has been building for years. But what's raised the stakes dramatically is one word: TRIP, Route for International Peace and Prosperity, also known as the Zangezur Corridor, is a proposed transit route brokered by Washington. The idea is straightforward: an unimpeded land connection running through Armenia's Sunik province, linking mainland Azerbaijan, its Nakhichevan enclave, and from there onward to Turkey and European markets. If this corridor gets built, it reshapes the entire economic geography of the South Caucasus. Trade flows that currently depend on Iranian and Russian transit routes would bypass them entirely. Armenia would become a connectivity hub rather than a landlocked hostage of its geography.
Putin recognizes that if Pashinyan can pull off the pivot from Russia to the West, and especially to integrate itself into Western political, security, or economic architecture, as it's doing with projects like TRIP, that it'll be pretty hard to get it back. And I think for that reason, Putin sees this as one for all the marbles, and is likely to try and use whatever means of influence he has at his disposal to try and tip the scales in his favor. And I think Pashinyan is well aware of that, which is why he's taken, I think, such a strong, if maybe even perhaps heavy-handed approach.
For Russia, trip means losing one of its last reliable levers in the South Caucasus. For Iran, it means being structurally bypassed, marginalized from east-west trade routes that Tehran has long used as strategic leverage. For both, preventing this corridor is not a preference, it's a strategic imperative. Armenia's parliamentary elections are scheduled for June 2026. Prime Minister Pashinyan has signaled that a renewed mandate would allow him to pursue a constitutional referendum, removing language from Armenia's 1990 Declaration of Independence that includes a territorial claim over Karabakh. That amendment is widely seen as a prerequisite for a comprehensive peace deal and for TRIP to move forward. So the clock is ticking, and everyone, Moscow, Tehran, Washington, Baku, Ankara, knows it. The church was already activated as a political force. TRIP gave the activization a concrete target and made the outcome of this struggle a matter of regional, not just national consequence.
Route for international peace and prosperity TRIP, similarly, would be a huge victory for Armenia in connecting it into the global economy and to the regional economy. So I think Pashinyan risks either undermining or maybe losing entirely the long-term buy-in to these projects if his campaign becomes too divisive and if he uses every tool at his disposal to attack the church and the opposition the way he has. I think, for the lack of a better way of putting it, he needs to remain civil and he needs to work on getting more people on board with his vision as opposed to shutting down people who might challenge it.
Russia isn't the only external actor in this story. Iran has its own reasons to keep Armenia off the Western integration path and its own approach to using the church. Publicly, Tehran presents the Armenian community in Iran as evidence of religious coexistence. The church is framed as a bridge of friendship between Tehran and Yerevan. It's a nice narrative. Behind the scenes, the picture is different. Ehsan Movahedian, a senior Iranian analyst on Caucasus affairs, has openly urged Iran to synergize with the Armenian Church to advance Iranian foreign policy objectives. And here's the striking part. He explicitly compared the church to the Husseiniun, Iran's Shiite proxy group operating in Azerbaijan, describing both as two wings of the Iranian influence in the South Caucasus. Now, the Armenian Church is obviously not a militant organization, but the analogy reveals how Tehran thinks about it, as a mechanism for shaping narratives, mobilizing constituencies, and constraining state decision-making without direct intervention. Iran's interest has been driven by TRIP. The corridor threatens to marginalize Iran's transit role entirely. Supreme Leader Khamenei called it a red line. Ali Akbar Velayati, a senior advisor to Khamenei, went further, warning that TRIP would become a graveyard for mercenaries by amplifying church narratives that frame the corridor and normalization as existential threats from a Turkic axis. Iran sought to foster domestic resistance to the constitutional and political changes required for the project without ever having to intervene directly. It's influenced through resonance, not coercion. And the think tank aligned with Iran's conservative strategic circles, IRES, went even further, describing Archbishop Gastanian as the authentic representative of the Armenian nation and hinting that the church could play a role analogous to the Shiite clergy in the 1979 Iranian Revolution. When a regime-aligned think tank draws parallels between an Armenian archbishop and the architects of the theocratic revolution, there's no ambiguity about the strategic intent. But here's what changes everything. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, a massive joint air campaign targeting Iranian military infrastructure, nuclear sites, and senior leadership. Supreme Leader Khamenei was killed in the strikes on Tehran. Iran's military capabilities have been severely degraded. The regime that built Iran's influence architecture in the South Caucasus, the IRGC networks, the proxy relationships, the intelligence links, is now fighting for its survival. Iran is retaliating with missiles and drones across the region. What does this mean for Armenia? It means the Iranian pressure on TRIP and Armenia's Western integration may be weakening in real time. But uncertainty cuts both ways. If the Islamic Republic collapses or is fundamentally restructured, the networks Tehran built to influence Armenian politics through the church and through aligned actors could lose their state backing entirely. A successor government oriented toward pragmatic relations with the West would have no interest in blocking a U.S. brokered corridor through the South Caucasus. But if the regime survives in weakened form, battered, isolated, and desperate, it may double down on exactly the kind of low-cost influence operations we've been describing: proxy narratives, church amplification, oligarchic networks. These are cheap tools for a regime that can no longer project conventional power. And a destabilized Iran on Armenia's southern border creates its own set of risks.
Because its nightmare scenario would probably be the collapse of the Iranian regime into total anarchy, because this creates a refugee problem, this creates a security problem. In so many ways, this would be disastrous for Armenia, just as it likely would be to Azerbaijan or to any of Iran's other neighbors. Because, if suddenly, a country of, almost 100 million people bursts into anarchy, or has no firm, stable government, it's going to create a lot of problems.
The Armenian government's crackdown on church-affiliated figures hasn't gone unnoticed in Moscow, and the reaction tells you everything about how the Kremlin sees this. The Russian Orthodox Church, itself a tool of Kremlin influence, condemned Armenia's actions, labeling the arrest of Karapetyan as political persecution. Russian media personalities like Margarita Simonyan and Vladimir Solovyev, both Kremlin propagandists, have openly called for Pashinyan's removal and for Russia to protect Karapetyan.
Пашинян – предатель армянского народа и ведет Армению к полному уничтожению. Если он будет оставаться у власти, и молодежь Армении, а также взрослые люди Армении будут продолжать его поддерживать, то не будет никакой Армении в течение лет 5.
When the head of RT and Russia's most prominent state TV host are publicly calling for regime change in a sovereign country because a billionaire oligarch got arrested, that's not commentary, that's a declaration of interest. The involvement of the Russian Orthodox Church, alongside pro-Kremlin propagandists, signals that Moscow views the situation in Armenia through a strategic lens. The church isn't just a religious institution being defended on principle. It's an asset being defended because it's useful. Pashinyan's government has tried two approaches, and neither has been clean. First, the political approach, arguing that the Constitution prohibits clerical involvement in partisan politics. This was technically correct, but strategically ineffective. It allowed the church to cast itself as a persecuted moral authority, which only strengthened its hand. So the government shifted tactics. Starting in late 2024, Pashinyan and government-aligned actors went after the spiritual legitimacy of Karakin II directly. They made public allegations that Catholicos violated his celibacy vow and fathered a child, a claim designed to strike at the very foundation of his authority within the church.
The church has also been guilty of this, of course. The patriarch is flinging insults back towards Pashinyan, and the church doesn't hesitate on multiple occasions to throw its weight behind political actors, or for political actors to throw their weight behind the church. I mean, we saw this with Karapetyan, and we saw it too with the Tavish for the Homeland movement back in 2025 over the question of border demarcation.
They raised accusations of financial corruption, opaque church finances, and collaboration with foreign intelligence services. The goal was unmistakable. If you can't beat the church on political grounds, discredit the man who leads it on spiritual ones. This is a high-stake move. Whether or not the specific claims are true, politicizing spiritual legitimacy threatens to polarize Armenian society and destabilize norms that have held for decades. It invites a backlash, not just from believers, but from anyone who sees the state reaching into sacred space. But from the government's perspective, the alternative is worse, accepting a parallel authority increasingly aligned with foreign strategic objectives, one that operates outside democratic accountability.
Церковь изначально понимала, какую сторону, какую политическую силу представляет Никол Пашинян. Потому что изначально, когда он был еще журналистом, он принадлежал таким политическим и интеллектуальным кругам Армении, которые требовали более рационального подхода. Решение карабахского вопроса, менее аннексионистской политики, более прагматических подходов. И они понимали, что с Пашиняном их дороги, несомненно, разойдутся, потому что надо понимать, что в оккупированных территориях, когда эти территории оккупированные находились под контролем Армении, там были много церквей, приходы, которые как бы имели огромное значение для армянской церкви. В этом отношении у них, конечно же, изначально были более негативные отношения к Пашиняну, и от него требовали как бы более радикального подхода.
And the confrontation isn't just political theater. On Palm Sunday 2026, Pashinyan entered St. Anna Church in Yerevan during a packed service. For weeks, he'd been visiting different churches on Sundays as part of an internal party campaign, a deliberate assertion of presence in spaces the church treats as its own. Critics, included political analyst Jacob Badanyan, called the visit provocative, entering a packed service late, surrounded by security, pushing toward the altar. As Pashinyan was leaving, a parishioner confronted him and attempted to strike him. 3 people were detained. Supporters say the incident proved the point. When a democratically elected prime minister can't walk into a church without being physically attacked, something has gone very wrong. The incident crystallized into what this conflict is really about. Not theology, but who holds legitimate authority in Armenia. The arrests of 2025, Gastanyan, Ajapakhian, Karapetyan, Proshian, and others, represent the sharpest confrontation between an Armenian government and the church in modern history. The government says it's enforcing the rule of law. The church says it's under siege. And the truth, as always, is caught somewhere in between, shaped by forces that extend far beyond Armenia's borders. Pashinyan has made his framing explicit. In the weeks before the vote, he and his allies cast the June 7th election as a binary choice, peace or war. Parliament Speaker Alan Simonyan put it bluntly, there's a party of war and there is a party of peace, and that's what voters are deciding. Pashinyan himself warned that if the opposition wins, war could return to the South Caucasus by autumn. The opposition, Karapetyan's Strong Armenia, Kocharyan's Armenia bloc, has promised to revisit the peace process with Azerbaijan and reopen the Karabakh question.
Որովհետև հենց այդ ամսից սկսվեց 44 օրյա ծանր պատերազմը։ Սեպտեմբերին սկսվեց Հայաստանի տարածքային ամբողջականության դեմ հարձակումը։ Սեպտեմբերին սկսվեց Արցախի բռնի հայաթափումը եւ էթնիկ զտումը։ Պատերազմներ, որտեղ Փաշինյանը պարտվեց, միտը մենք թույլ ենք տալու, որ նա Հայաստանի համար եւս մեկ պատերազմ պարտվի։
Pashinyan's position is that even mentioning Karabakh in church liturgies is going down the path of war. He fired the director of the Armenian Genocide Museum for giving vice presidents a book on Karabakh history during his visit to Yerevan. The message to voters, clergy, and civil servants is identical. The past is closed, and anyone who reopens it is choosing conflict. And then came April 1st, and what happened in the Kremlin makes the stakes unmistakable.
Уважаемый Никол Владимирович,
Putin told Pashinyan that dual Russian-Armenian citizens, including Karapetyan, currently under house arrest in Yerevan, should be allowed to run in the elections.
некоторые, я знаю, находятся в местах лишения свободы, несмотря на то, что у них паспорт российский есть. Это ваше решение, мы не вмешиваемся, но хотелось бы, чтобы они все могли, во всяком случае, принять участие в этой внутриполитической работе.
Then added, with a hint of menace,
У нас в Армении очень много друзей, очень много, мы это знаем.
Pashinyan didn't flinch.
В этих выборах могут принять участие те граждане, только имеют исключительно армянский паспорт.
Then he twisted the knife. On camera, in the Kremlin,
Армения демократическая страна, и у нас есть граждане, которые думают, что в Армении слишком много демократии, но это для нас принципиальный вопрос. У нас социальные сети, например, на 100% свободны, нет вообще никаких ограничений, и очень много граждан думают, что это слишком.
Putin warned that EU and European Economic Union membership are simply untenable. Pashinyan batted it away. When the time comes, Armenian citizens will decide. And he took Putin to task over the CSTO's failure to defend Armenia during the Second Karabakh War.
Мы до сих пор не в состоянии объяснять нашему народу, нашим гражданам, почему ОДКБ не среагировала вопреки тем обязательствам, которые есть согласно договору об организации о коллективной безопасности.
The Russian reaction was swift. Deputy Prime Minister Overchuk warned that Russia may need to reconsider economic relations with Armenia. The Armenian newspaper Khraparak reported the Kremlin concluded compromise with Pashinyan is no longer possible and is considering travel restrictions and sanctions against Armenian officials, businesses, and cultural organizations aligned with the current government. Even Armenia's ambassador to Russia, described as having warm personal ties to Moscow, has allegedly been treated as persona non grata. This is the Kremlin telling Armenian elites, choose your sides before June. Because we're keeping score. It's a pressure campaign designed to work in tandem with exactly the kind of church-based and oligarchic mobilization we've been describing. Squeeze from above, destabilize from within.
Поэтому для Кремля не звучит как бы фантастикой повторить кейс. То есть он удобный для Кремля человек, он полностью подотчетный Кремля. Намерение его повернуть курс Армении в сторону, там, допустим, от проевропейского курса, опять вновь в орбиту Кремля, у него намерение именно такое же. То есть так же, как удалось, если удалось в представлении Кремля с Грузией, где была враждебность России очень огромная, да, за такой короткий. Почему не получится с Арменией, где пророссийских настроений все-таки огромное количество?
Step back and what you see is a country at a crossroads, and that's about much more than Armenia alone. This is about whether a small democracy can break free from a post-Soviet patronage system when the patrons, Russia and Iran, still have institutional footholds inside the country. It's about whether religious authority, historically a guardian of identity, can be repurposed as an instrument of foreign influence. And it's about whether Western connectivity projects like TRIP can survive the kind of hybrid resistance that Moscow and Tehran have perfected. What makes this moment different from even 6 months ago is that one of those two patrons is now under direct military assault, its supreme leader dead, its future as a state in question. Russia's other key regional ally, Assad's Syria, already fell. If Iran's regime follows, Moscow loses its last major partner on its entire southern arc, from the Mediterranean to the Caspian. That doesn't mean Russia's influence in Armenia disappears, but it means the church and its aligned networks may be among the most potent institutional levers Moscow has left in the South Caucasus, which makes the stakes of Armenia's June 2026 elections even higher. Armenia isn't the only country facing these questions. Georgia, Moldova, Serbia, across the post-Soviet and post-Ottoman space, the same patterns recur. Churches, oligarchs, intelligence legacies, and strategic corridors. The tactics vary, the logic doesn't. As Armenia approaches June 2026, the central question is no longer simply whether it will build a corridor or amend its constitution. The question is deeper. Will democratic institutions or ecclesiastical structures repurposed as instruments of foreign influence ultimately arbitrate sovereignty in the South Caucasus? The Armenian Apostolic Church has been a guardian of Armenian identity for 17 centuries. The legacy is not in question. What is in question is whether the legacy is being weaponized by Moscow, by Tehran, by oligarchs, to keep Armenia locked in the past that serves everyone's interest except Armenia's own. The answer to that question won't just shape Armenia, it will signal whether post-Soviet order can actually be dismantled, or whether its ghosts still run the show. Thanks for watching. This video was based on an analysis by Senior Fellow Alex Greenberg for the Turan Research Center. We've included the link in the description. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We cover the geopolitics of the Turkic and Persian worlds, the stories most outlets miss, but that shape the world we live in.